wanted to just welcome everyone and thank you for coming today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elise Skolnick, the newly elected president of the Press Club. And today, thank you. And today I'm happy to welcome Paul Furiga as part of our speaker series. And I'd like to thank the sponsor of our event, Furiga Communications. We can't do it without our sponsors. And I want to thank the Steel Museum and Jonathan Camboris for partnering with us to use this beautiful space. It's excellent for what we need. Following his talk, Paul will be signing and selling his book, Finding Your Capital S Story, so be sure to stick around for that. And don't forget about our next event on Thursday, June 12th. We're hosting a panel discussion on the Freedom of Information Act. It will be at noon at the library in downtown, and reservations are due by June 5th. And now I'd like to ask Dan Pecchia to come up and introduce Paul.
Thanks, Elise. Informally, Paul runs WordWrite. We've always looked at that as sort of the bigger brother, bigger city version of Furiga Communications. We'd like to aspire to be like Paul someday. It's a tall order, that's for sure. But Paul Furiga is president and CEO of WordWrite. It's a Pittsburgh communication agency. Before he ever spent a day doing PR, he spent more than 20 years in news and journalism, which makes him a great PR guy by definition. Paul was, in the last 4 years of his news career, the editor of the Pittsburgh Business Times, and he wrote and edited more than 20,000 stories in his news career. Paul later served in leadership at Ketchum PR, one of the country's largest PR agencies, and worked for high-profile clients like Delta and Alcoa and Firestone. In 2002, he founded WordWrite 3 years before Furiga.com hit the map. And it's an award-winning agency that focuses on helping clients find their capital S story. And that's what we're going to hear about today. In fact, Paul's book is available today, right? And buy a copy, and maybe Paul will sign one for us if we're nice to him. So with no further ado, let's welcome Paul Furiga. Thanks for coming, Paul.
Well, Dan, I want to say thank you for that awesome introduction, and I'm going to walk a little bit. I'll try not to blow out the speakers. I am in a band, so sadly and dangerously for all of you, I know how to use one of these things. Not as a weapon, though. I don't do that. Well, maybe when I sing. It depends on how you look at it. It's so great to be here. A lot of friends in the room. Tim Fitzpatrick, my first client at WordWrite. He's in the book. We were talking about it. I didn't name him, probably because there was a long legal agreement he was going to force me to sign that required me to hand over all the royalties from the book. I don't know. That's not true. And I also got to meet Diane. Diane's wonderful. I wondered how occasionally Tim would be on the straight and narrow over the years, and now I understand. She keeps him in line. That's very, very good. Went to college with Mary Beth and Tom Breckenridge. They're here. I can say I knew them when they first met, right? When they started dating. How long you guys been married now?
40 years.
40 years, okay, yeah. My wife and I also met at Miami when we were on the student newspaper. I called her Brenda, my girlfriend, so often that people would refer to her not as Brenda, but as Brenda, my girlfriend. That was a standing joke. And Dan, we've known each other, I don't know, man, 30 years, maybe. Yeah, right. Dan has had tickets to the Pirates over the years. Do you still? Oh my God. Yeah, so when I was editor of the Business Times, Dan, that's how there were times when he needed to talk to the Pittsburgh media, and we struck up a conversation. He invited me to Pirates games and stuff, and we've been friends ever since. And maybe we're more twins, our agencies, than the big brother, whatever. That is so kind of you to say. But there have been times, especially in crisis situations, when occasionally I'll call Dan or Dan will call me. how would you handle this situation? And we'll chat about that. So it's really great to be in Youngstown. I grew up in Cleveland, and I'm in Pittsburgh now. And many times I've driven past on the turnpike and said to myself, gee, I wish I had a good reason to go to Youngstown. So today I do. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Okay. Now the clicker's not working. Ah, how about that? So the clicker fell asleep. Let's hope that none of you do. Okay? All right. So let's start this where all good stories start. Once upon a time. Once upon a time on a forgotten Friday in a city down the road called Pittsburgh, I was sitting in the editor's office of the Pittsburgh Business-Times. Because it was Friday, the newspaper had just come out. Anybody remember newspapers? What they used to be like. So I'm holding this thing in my hands, and I could smell the ink. Remember that? And the paper was damp because it had come off the press not too long ago. Another issue out the door. Thank God. Suddenly, the phone rang. And I looked down at the caller ID, and it said Ketchum Public Relations. Now, you have to know that Ketchum Public Relations is, as Dan suggested, the 5th largest PR agency in the world. And it was started in Pittsburgh in 1923 by two brothers named Ketchum, curiously enough. By the way, no relation to Ketchum, Idaho, which is a beautiful place, but nothing to do with Ketchum. So there used to be this thing called the journalistic ladder of success. Have any of you been journalists? Right? You've been on that? Now it's a manhole to oblivion. Okay? But what you used to do is you'd get a job, and then to get a better job, you'd move to another city. So over the course of my time in journalism, we moved quite a bit. And got to cover everything from murders to the White House. Although not murders in the White House. Check out the Shondaland show, The Residents, if you want to know what that's like. So I'm sitting in my office there, and the phone rings, and you know, my company had told me, American City Business Journals, which is part of Advanced Publications, which owns the Cleveland Plain Dealer and owns Papers in New Jersey and Vanity Fair and a bunch of other stuff, that they liked me and they were going to promote me. They were going to move me. And I said, great. Where? And they said, oh, we don't know. Could be Oklahoma City or Sacramento or Fort Lauderdale. And I said, okay, when? Oh, we don't know. But we know you'll be happy to go when you go. So what I had started to do was network quietly with people in Pittsburgh to figure out how I might be able to stay in Pittsburgh. Our kids were small. I was telling Tim, Mary Beth, and Tom at lunch, we had family there. While I grew up in Cleveland, my dad's from the Pittsburgh area. We wound up taking care of two of my aunts and one of my cousins until they passed. So we're kind of looking around. So the phone rings, I pick up the phone. It's Larry Warner, who for years was the head of the Pittsburgh office, the founding office of Ketchum PR. And I had asked a number of people on the QT, including Larry, to help me maybe find another job in town. So I pick up the phone. Paul, is Larry. Hey, Larry. He's like, I'm not going to help you. So I'm sitting there looking at this damp paper, and I'm like going through it because I'm like, this guy runs the largest PR office in Pittsburgh, 80 people. What did we write? And after what seemed like 10 minutes, but was probably only 3 seconds, Larry had a very dry sense of humor. He says, well, aren't you going to ask me why I'm not going to help you? And I said, okay, Larry, why? And he said, because I want you to come work for me. And I will tell you that journalists may be many things, and some of you might have a lot of knowledge about that, but we're not really great networkers, right? So when I asked him to help me find a job, I never thought that he would offer me a job, but he did. And if Larry hadn't offered me that job, I wouldn't be here today, and we would not be talking about the subject that we are talking about today. So here's the thing, and those of you who've been journalists or work with journalists know this. It is not the job of journalists or employees or customers or investors or partners to figure out what an organization's story is. That is the job of the leaders of the organization. And most of the failures that occur in marketing and public relations occur because there's not a good story. And there is a story that every organization should tell. It's their own story. The people they want to reach should see it, hear it, experience it. We call it the capital S story, and we're going to dig into that today. I think this is going to keep falling asleep here. Yeah, those are just a few of the places that I've worked. I was with Thomson in D.C., what's now Thomson Reuters. Wrote for the Repository. I was their correspondent in D.C. for a while, at the Enquirer, Pittsburgh Business Times. Pittsburgh is in a lot of ways, like Dan said, kind of just a bigger Youngstown. So I'm sure that a lot of people are born here, they grow up here, they live here, they die here. So for people in Pittsburgh, the only job in journalism I ever had was at the Pittsburgh Business Times. They're like, you covered the White House? Yeah, I did. You covered Reagan and Bush? Yeah, and Clinton too. Really? Because people don't usually do that, right? Okay. And as Dan said, what's important about that? If you've been a journalist or you work with journalists, you know that good journalists know how to craft a good story, right? I'm so old, when the Cincinnati Enquirer digitized their library, they sent me from the morgue. Do people remember what morgues are? Anybody? All right. There used to be 3 people on the Enquirer staff, and they worked in the library. They didn't like when you called it the morgue, although some of them looked like, they could be there. 3 people would cut apart the newspaper every day and paste every story into books. And when the Enquirer digitized its library, they did a very nice thing, and they sent me all the books. And so I counted how many stories I wrote. That's not a BS number. I wrote 10,000 stories. When I was in the Thomson newspaper's Washington Bureau, Lord Thomson demanded a weekly report from the Bureau on how many stories were written that week. We averaged about 162 stories a week. I know that because I was not only a correspondent, but I also was the deputy bureau chief, and I had to write and send that report for a while. So what's important about that? You're with people in the best of times and the worst of times. You really learn what it takes to create a great story, right? And I got to tell you, most organizations, they don't tell a good story, and they have one at their fingertips, which we're going to talk about in the next several minutes. This research was actually done 10 years ago. There have been newer studies done that validate this. Think about this economy that we live in today. If you're still buying things on Amazon, and I know some people aren't, reviews. What are other people saying about whether you should work with somebody? Well, in the business context, if you need an attorney, or you need an accountant, or you need a realtor, or you need, pick your industry or your company, what other people say about that organization is going to make a big difference. And how do people come to understand in their minds what an organization represents? The story. And this study found that even if the person giving the recommendation doesn't intend to buy something from that company, if they like the story, they're almost as likely to recommend that organization as somebody who's actually going to buy. So why don't we do this more often? Why are businesses so caught up in features and benefits and garbage like that? As a journalist, former journalist, a recovering journalist, an extinct species, I don't know, what are we these days? I'd have people call me up at the Business Times. Hey, it's our 47th anniversary. Are you going to write a story about us? And sometimes people will get contentious. And I'd say, what does the masthead say? It says the Business Times, not the Anniversary Times. And then they want to argue with me. I'd say, I'll tell you what, we'll write a story about your 47th anniversary if you can tell me the headline and the subject of the last 47th anniversary story we ran. Silence, right? So here's the story that people are missing. We call it the capital S story because it stands above all the other stories that an organization needs to share. It answers 4 fundamental questions. Why would somebody buy from you? Why would somebody work for you? Which has been really important the last 4 or 5 years. Coming out of COVID, and into the world we live in today? Why would somebody invest in you if that's important to you? And why would somebody partner with you? A lot of businesses in this world, in this economy, they exist by having other organizations partner with them, either to develop sales leads, deliver product or services, et cetera, et cetera. I've got a little video here for you, and props, Jonathan. We're going to see if this works, right? Okay.
Find the terms really quickly. Every single person, every single organization on the planet knows what they do, 100%. Some know how they do it, whether you call it your differentiating value proposition or your proprietary process or your USP. But very, very few people or organizations know why they do what they do. And by why, I don't mean to make a profit. That's a result. It's always a result. By why, I mean what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? Why does your organization exist? Well, as a result, the way we think, the way we act, the way we communicate is from the outside in. It's obvious. We go from the clearest thing to the fuzziest thing. But the inspired leaders and the inspired organizations, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry, all think, act, and communicate from the inside out. Let me give you an example. I use Apple because they're easy to understand and everybody gets it. If Apple were like everyone else, a marketing message from them might sound like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? Meh. And that's how most of us communicate. That's how most marketing is done, that's how most sales is done, and that's how most of us communicate interpersonally. We say what we do, we say how we're different or how we're better, and we expect some sort of behavior, a purchase, a vote, something like that. Here's our new law firm. We have the best lawyers, the biggest clients. We always perform for our clients, do business with us. Here's our new car. It gets great gas mileage. It has, leather seats. Buy our car. But it's uninspiring. Here's how Apple actually communicates. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers. Want to buy one? Totally different, right? You're ready to buy a computer from me. All I did was reverse the order of the information. People don't buy what you do, people buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. This is...
How many of you are familiar with Simon Sinek? Okay, a few of you. How many have read one of his books? All right, this is 2009. It's a TEDx talk before TEDx Talks got as professional looking as TED Talks. He wrote a book after this based on this talk called Start With Why. Highly recommend it. He's written 3 books. That one, Leaders Eat Last, and The Infinite Game, which I also highly recommend. It'll tell you a lot about what millennials and Xers are looking for in the organizations they join as employees. I'm going to send Diane the slide deck afterwards. That's a hot link. There might be a few others in the deck. You'll be able to look at this stuff later on if you're interested in it. Former journalists in the room, man bites dog is news, right? Most of what is out there in marketing and PR is so freaking boring, right? If any of you have worked for a public company, reading an earnings release is, who needs drugs? That'll put you to sleep, right? For years I've taught at Point Park University in Pittsburgh, and one of the classes I've taught was for people who have an undergraduate degree and they're going to get into PR as a graduate degree. I don't know why, but that's what they want to do. And so the night when we open up Business Wire and PR Newswire, and I have them read all the releases from that day, they're like, oh my God, these are terrible. And they are, right? They're just terrible. So what people are buying is why you do it. They want more than just features and benefits and bullet points. They want to know, what's the character and nature of this organization? Why should I engage with this company or this nonprofit? What am I going to get from them that's different than what everybody else does? And believe me, even if you don't think you have a competitor in the marketplace of ideas or products or services or whatever, you do. And that's called doing nothing. Thank you, I'm fine. I don't need your revolutionary iPad or iPod or whatever. I'm just going to sit here with my Zune and try and figure out how it works, right? Okay. Now, one of the things in 23 years in business and 300 clients, we've worked with a number of companies and we've been able to identify narrative structures that define what we call this capital S story. And here are 5 examples. And if you think about the news here in Youngstown or nationally, you'll see these stories all the time, especially in the business press. How did a company get started? Why did the person start the company, the CEO, or a tech company, the technologist? Or maybe it's a dream or a vision or a passion. You know, there's got to be a better way to build a mousetrap, right? It's an innovation. Takes things in a direction that people didn't expect. Maybe it's a coming of age, and we'll talk about some of these in a few minutes, examples of these kinds of companies. And maybe it's an epiphany, or it could be an accident. I always talk about 3M. You know, they were trying to make the world's stickiest glue and they failed and they made Post-it notes. I probably have 10 of them in my backpack here, right? So those sorts of things happen. Now, those aren't the only kind of capital S stories you'll find in the world, but they are common. Now, here's the other thing. Even companies that have great stories don't use them well. Especially post-COVID. I don't care what you do. I don't care if you're a restaurant where people walk up and order food on the spot. Your website is your digital storefront. Especially true for B2B companies. That's where people need to get your story first. Google tells us that people will spend on average about 3 seconds on a homepage or less. And then, where are they going to go? If they like you, they're going to go to the About page. So you got to grab them with some piece of your story on the homepage and then pull them in deeper on the About page. Guess what? Social media profiles are important, and not just the company or organizational ones, the leadership ones too. We'll work with a lot of law firms and engineering firms. If I'm going to hire you to build a complicated project, that's a people thing. Who are these people? And if I go out to LinkedIn and you haven't updated your LinkedIn in 20 years and it looks like you're looking for an entry-level job and you've come to pitch me as being a senior engineer to build my complicated project, I'm going to say, I don't know if I'm that interested in it. Certainly for those of us who spend a lot of time in the PR world, your press release boilerplate, that paragraph that's in your press release that says about this organization. You know, Google, to preserve its leadership in search, has really amped up its AI capabilities. This is the first place their AI is going to look. What does your company say about itself? So you want your story to be there, so that if that result at the top of Google comes back, that you're part of that result. Advertising, of course, sales materials. I've been at this long enough, you know, in the old days I'd go to visit somebody in person, and it'd be winter, and they'd say, go hang up your coat, and I'd open the closet, and that's where all the bad marketing materials were, because none of the salespeople would use them, right? So if you have good sales materials, they better have the story in there, and certainly talent communications. And we saw a lot of this when we were working with companies and organizations coming out of COVID. Remember when there was this incredible market for talent, and talent could demand any salary they wanted? It was really tough, wasn't it? Well, guess what? And especially if you read Sinek's book, The Infinite Game, millennials and Zs, they were looking for what he calls just cause companies. Steve Jobs, he said he wanted to put a dent in the universe. Okay, so he didn't want to blow it up, but he wanted to make a mark. And that's what these folks are looking for in companies. They don't want to just be canning toxic waste all day long. If they're canning toxic waste to save the environment, oh, well, that sounds like a good idea, right? So talent communications, too, are critically important. And by the way, not just for new hires, for people who are already on board. You don't want those people to disappear, right? Okay, so here's another thing we've learned. There's 3 critical elements to success in sharing your capital S story. Not surprisingly, the first one is authenticity. Now, what does that mean? If we were a few blocks away and we were going to lunch, and half of us got across the intersection and half of us didn't, we saw this traffic accident. From one vantage point, some of us saw one thing, and from the other vantage point, somebody saw something else. Now, does that mean one group of people are liars and the other group is truth tellers? No, it just means we saw different aspects of the same thing. How does this apply in business and communications? People want choice. So as long as your story is rooted in authenticity, it doesn't have to be the same as your competitor's story. When I was at Ketchum one time, we had a big company, not Tim's company. Tim and I worked together there too, but a different company. And the CEO said, "This is my competitor. They got a front page story in the Wall Street Journal. I want the same story." Well, number one, good luck trying to get your story in the Wall Street Journal. Number two, they're not going to write the same story. They already wrote that story. What's your story? And I guarantee you every organization has a great story. So what any critical audience, whether it's the media, whether it's customers, whether it's potential employees, is looking for is authenticity. Yeah, I buy that. I can see your take on this problem or this issue. So your story has to be authentic. Now the other thing is, you got to have the right people telling the story. Everybody know who this is? Richard Branson. Guy famous for starting like 400 companies with the word virgin in them. I don't really know why, but okay, you know. Now, he's a fluent storyteller, right? If you want to know anything about a virgin company, he's probably a good guy to talk to. But here's the thing. A fluent storyteller in any organization, for-profit or non-profit, it shouldn't always be the CEO. The example I give, and you have some great healthcare institutions here in Youngstown, if God forbid I need surgery, you know, the hospital may have a very competent CEO. I don't want to talk to the CEO about my surgery. I want to talk to the doctor. I want to talk to the caregivers. That's the fluent storyteller. If I'm considering buying a software platform for my company, don't I maybe want to talk to the technical team? And shouldn't those people be sharing a consistent story, the same basic story that governs the entire organization and describes its character and its nature? So this is something that a lot of companies really don't think about, sadly, to their detriment. They'll have great marketing materials, and you know, I always hate when I'm interacting with somebody and, you know, a service call. And the service guy, you say, "Oh, well, you know, I was told blah, blah, blah." And the person says, "Yeah, Dan, nah, that's not true. We don't do that." Wow, that's terrible, right? So you want to be sharing the same story as well as it being authentic. Now, this is critically important. And this is where so much marketing and PR is wasted money. My competitors on Facebook jump on Facebook without even thinking about it. I mean, if you decided right now that you were going to drive all the way from Youngstown to California, you probably would have a map and a budget and a route. But too many people just throw money out there on their marketing. I have this in the book. A lot of really hard-boiled CEOs will tell us that storytelling is just foo-foo, but it's not. Dr. Yuri Hassan at Princeton University, using functional MRI machines, did this fantastic study about 10 years ago. He had an undergraduate student tell her worst prom story, and it was a doozy too. And he, you know, if you've ever had an MRI, anybody had an MRI? Okay, they slide you into this tube for like half an hour, and they're like, "You want to listen to the radio? You want the music out there?" So he had her inside the tube, and she told her story, and they recorded her brainwave activity, and then they did a double blind test with dozens of participants and had them listen to her story. And guess what? They discovered that the brainwaves of the storyteller and the story audience synced up. Some of you are old enough to remember the movies of the 30s and Rogers and Astaire, you know. Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, supposedly Ginger Rogers did everything he did backwards and in heels, right? Okay, so that's the concept of great storytelling. Ever been to a great film and you wanted it to continue? Or a play or a concert? That's what we're talking about here. Engagement at a deep biological level. And that's what Dr. Hassan found out. That's for real. There have been a lot of studies since then that have validated this concept. For those of us who spend our time in marketing and PR, we're not going to throw everybody inside a functional MRI, although I will tell you that there are, the last time I looked, there's 5 companies in Hollywood that will take movie audiences for previews, and they will do this kind of research to see how the film is doing before it's released. In a way that's kind of freaky, but in a way it's very validating, right? It's like, okay, well, they're going to spend $100 million on a movie and they want to make sure that it makes money at the box office. Let's see if people really like it, right? In the world that we live in, what we're looking for are metrics such as the spike in interaction, positive reviews, happier customers, more referrals. I'm not going to spend time in my presentation talking about how to do that, but if we're interested in that, we can talk about that later. Okay, Paul, that's all kind of interesting maybe, and I can read it in the book if I want, but what does this really mean in practice? So we talked about cynic. He's one of the taproots of our work. People buy why you do what you do, not what you do. Dr. Hassan, but there's more. So it's World War I, and one of the fathers of psychoanalysis named Carl Jung is practicing in Switzerland. And as in World War II, Switzerland is a neutral country. What does that mean? That means that people are fleeing the fighting from all over Europe. It's traumatic. A lot of them wind up on Jung's couch. And after a period of time, Jung realizes that the people he's seeing are telling the same stories over and over again, good and bad. This leads him to develop this concept he calls the collective unconscious. In Jung's view, which again has been validated by later research, our brains are hardwired for specific storylines. They exist in our brains, yet in marketing and PR, we don't tap into those stories often enough to create great results. And that's what companies need to do. But it's not just Carl Jung. Joseph Campbell might be the most famous academic never to get a PhD, and kind of thank God he didn't. Because what happened was it was the Depression, and he'd applied to PhD programs and couldn't get into one. Instead, he got a fellowship, an overseas fellowship. He traveled the world, and no matter where he went, whatever country he visited, regardless of language or economic attainment, occupation, he found that people were telling the same story over and over again. The most common archetypal story that you'll see in literature, pop culture, and in business is what's known as the hero's journey. That is the concept that Campbell came up with. He had this great book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. It's the only book I've ever read that has footnotes in it that are actually interesting to read. So, if you ever find a copy in a used bookstore, pick it up. It'll be fun. It's not exactly a beach read, but it's a good one. So everything he does is about the story. How many of you are Star Wars fans? Anybody? A lot of Star Wars fans don't like to admit that they're Star Wars fans, but okay. There's this guy named George Lucas. He decided he wanted to do a Greek-style 9-part film series called Star Wars. The very first thing he did was he sat down with Joseph Campbell. I said, Joe, how do I do this? What's the hero's journey? Luke Skywalker's journey is the hero's journey. A lot of times in marketing and PR, you'll see people talking about the hero's journey as being the only story you can tell. But that is not the only story you can tell. I have a book from the 1800s in France, and it has 300 story archetypes in it. Luckily for me, it's in English, otherwise I couldn't read it, but it is from France. So in our work, we talk about archetypal stories or archetypes, and a lot of very smart people who don't do what we do are like, what the hell is that? It's a story model. So if you come to this meeting next month, and Dan, you're in front of me and you're sponsoring, so I'm going to pick on you. If Dan comes in next month and says, we got this great new tech client, and they do, and then from there on it's like, an adult is talking to you in a Charlie Brown cartoon. You're like, what did you say? But if Dan comes in and he says, we got this great new client, they're in the tech space, it's a David and Goliath story. You do not have to be a biblical scholar to know that's the underdog story. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about archetypal stories. Now, one of the things that's interesting is there's not just one kind of hero, okay? Does anybody know who this is? All right.
Well, the guy that puts all the stuff in the blender and blows it up?
Yes. You win the prize, Dan. Well done. This is Tom Dixon, the retired CEO of a little company called Blendtec. It's 2005. The company's growing. They hire their first marketing person. It says first day on the job. He joined the company the same year this little social media platform called YouTube debuted. So he's walking down the hall to get coffee, and he walks past the R&D lab, and he hears this terrible noise coming out of there. And he looks inside, and there's Tom Dixon with gloves on and safety glasses and a lab coat, looking like Bill Nye the Science Guy on a bad day. And he's grinding something in a blender that you shouldn't put inside a blender. And so the guy says to him, Tom, what the hell are you doing? And he says, we make the best commercial blenders in the world, and to prove it, we will grind anything in them. YouTube marketing guy, bing, the longest running viral B2B video series on YouTube. Now, since then, the company has been bought by private equity and sold, and they now make consumer versions of their blenders. I think you can get them at Costco and a few other places. That is an archetypal story. We call that the jester, because he's funny. Now, that's kind of a rare archetypal story, but it's a good one. I mean, we work with a lot of financial advisory firms. You do not want a jester managing your money, especially not today, right? Would not be a good thing. Does anybody know who this is? Yeah. If I said the word Canva, yes, this is Melanie Perkins, who with her husband had this idea while they were at Stanford Business School in the early aughts. Gee, I never thought I'd be old enough to say aughts like my grandparents. I remember the aughts. But anyway, they're at Stanford Business School, and they're like, you know what? Why do you have to buy an expensive Adobe license to do simple graphics on your computer? What if there were a cloud-based solution? And they're business professors, and everybody on Sand Hill Road, which is where all the VCs hang out in that part of the world, were like, this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Well, along comes COVID, and guess what? Melanie is worth $1.8 billion, and so is her husband. They've signed the Warren Buffett pledge to give away most of their wealth. This is an example of that archetypal story I talked about earlier, where something finally becomes an idea that people are willing to accept. Now, in the beginning, she was an outlaw, which is another archetypal family, and she was also an explorer. She was pushing the limits, right? We talked about him a bunch already today. Jobs actually epitomized several different archetypal stories. In the beginning, he was an outlaw. And can I say this here? An asshole? He got fired by John Scully. I spoke to a group in Philadelphia a couple weeks ago, and the guy who ran the groups I spoke to, this amazes me, went to business school with Mitt Romney and W and was in the same class with them. Was a senior executive at Kmart years ago and had Jack Welch begging for him to buy their light bulbs. And also was on a board with John Scully, and he was telling me what Scully told him about how bad Jobs was. But you see, if Jobs hadn't been an outlaw and gone to this little company called Pixar, he wouldn't have developed the persona as an explorer and a creator that allowed him to come back to Apple in his second iteration and stand there and hold this little box in his hand and say, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Anybody remember that? So in addition to representing these particular archetypal heroic stories, what you see is that there can be many chapters to the life of a leader as well as a business. I like to throw in local examples. During COVID, everybody was talking about healthcare heroes and what are we going to do for them and everything. but I don't know many places. This is Allegheny Health Network, which is owned by Highmark, the Blue Cross Blue Shield down in Pittsburgh. They did a series with Marvel Comics, making their nurses actually heroes. Yeah, I mean, not one, like 6 or 8 of them. I thought it was genius. Now, they also paid them bonuses and took care of them. I don't want to, lead you to think that was all they did, but it was like, we're going to put our money where our mouth is and we're going to do something really special. So I thought that was great. So if you're thinking about this for your own organization or your clients, or you're just curious about it, how do you do this for yourself? By aligning these kinds of story types with the people in your organization. And you don't have to be big or famous for this to work either. Now, I wasn't kidding when I said this is a science. This is an archetypal wheel, an archetype wheel. It's the one we use at our firm. It's ours. There are many that you could go on the internet and find that are similar. There's an organization to all of this, right? And I'm just going to explain a little bit. The green in the center tells you the different archetypal heroes. What are they looking for? So a caregiver is looking to bring structure, and so is a ruler and a creator. Whereas the sage and the explorer are looking for freedom. And the champion or the magician is looking for prestige, right? The archetypal families, and there's 12, are on the outer rim, and in the center are descriptors for them. So the everyman is authentic, inclusive, practical. The magician is transformative, clever, charming. Now, as I talked about earlier, this is all hardwired in our brains. So instead of marketing our ideas or our companies or our organizations by just typing out a bunch of bull crap on a PowerPoint slide, let's take a look at what's really animating the organization. In Sinek's words, why do we do what we do? So a question for you, whatever brought you here today, whether you're in this line of work or you're just curious or you're a retired journalist and you want to find out what some former journalist is doing with his life by talking about story, whatever your motivating issue, I would ask you to consider, who is your hero? What's driving you? And then they all lived happily ever after, right? I can remember being the oldest of 4 kids, having the same stories read to me over and over every night, and that's how they always ended. And then they lived happily ever after, right? And of course, later on, as a parent, doing the same thing, right? So I just want to show you an example here. At our firm, we look at story this way. The more complex your story and the more difficulty you have sharing it, the more we like you, because the more we can help you. So we work with this very interesting accounting firm, national firm, but based out of Pittsburgh. All they do is audit for-profit higher education. So everything from like art institutes to truck driving schools. When President Obama was in the White House, his education department started a national investigation and effort to root out fraud in student loans, a lot of it for veterans. And this firm came to us and said, holy cow, do we need to change our story? This is all we do. So we're just skimming the top here. We did a lot of research, primary and secondary, to determine that, in fact, they were in the right business. And despite all the bad stuff that was happening, if there was a good actor, it was them. But we decided that their primary archetypal story was that of the sage. How did we decide that? Because in doing our research and talking with the managing partner, while all this is going on with the Obama administration, there was a big meeting in Washington. Hundreds of people were coming. And the person running this effort for the government got sick the night before. And they decided they were going to still have the conference. They called our client and said to the managing partner, our guy's sick. Will you deliver the keynote instead? Now, when the hand of God, in this case the federal government, reaches down and says, you're the expert, you are the expert. But remember, we're talking about accountants here. Any accountants in the room? No, this is a very non-accountant room, isn't it? Okay, good. They don't go around the face of the earth saying, hi, hire me, I'm a sage, right? They just don't do that, right? In fact, most of them don't even like the network. But by effectively infusing the SAGE concept into their story, we help them grow their business. And the way that looked, and we're not always doing taglines when we do this, your archetypal story is the engine under the hood, okay? A lot of times, people don't buy a vehicle because of the engine under the hood. They're buying the whole package, the vehicle, right? So you don't have to be walking around with your archetypal story on your sleeve, right? It needs to be in there. In this case, however, it did wind up being a tagline. We're not going to say we're sages, but we will say we're provide a higher grade of accounting. And that's worked well for them. So a lot of times I'll be asked, okay, all very interesting, nice for you to talk about Steve Jobs and stuff like that. What about you? So here's our boilerplate. And I've called out for you the 3 archetypal storylines that we use. When we moved into our office in the old Alcoa building in downtown Pittsburgh, if you know where the William Penn is and the Monica were catty corner across the street from them, we named our conference rooms Explorer, Champion, and Outlaw. So we work hard at living our story too. We're like the chef that eats their own cooking. We're not going to tell you to try something if we haven't done it ourselves. Now, you know, most of us, even if we're not considering ourselves to be great storytellers, we come to a meeting and we have an introduction with somebody. Elevator speech. I hate that term. You know why I hate that term? Who's bought anything on an elevator in here? Right? Call things what they are. It's your introduction. Hi, I'm Paul. I'm from Pittsburgh. This is what I do. That's a good place to start if you're thinking about this concept of a capital S story. And then, as you go along, you can start to use it in other places, as I talked about at the beginning. Now, this comes up quite frequently. Story in marketing and PR has become a term much like breathing. So there's companies like Don Miller's Story Brand and others that are pretty well known, and they talk about this. There is a difference between a capital S story and a brand story. And the difference is this: the brand story is primarily speaking to one audience. It's speaking to the customer audience. Most organizations have other stakeholder groups they need to speak to, not just the people buying their products. So that's the difference. Capital S story is designed to speak to all those audiences. I wrote in addition to the book, I'm a co-author of another book called Ready, Connect, Grow. And my chapter in that book is Your Story is a Diamond with Many Facets. So what does that mean? Diamonds, their value depends in part on the clarity. So your story's got to be clear, but also on the facets. So the facet of your story that's interesting to prospective employees may not be the same facet that's interesting to potential customers, but it better roll up to the same story, because 15 minutes I can get on the internet and find out if you're full of BS, right? So it's the same story, but different facets might be interesting. What if you don't have a dramatic founding or hero? You don't have a Steve Jobs. You have a good story. In the book, I talk about my journalism professor at Miami, Mary Beth. Tom, you remember John Lowry?
Yeah.
Okay. So woe be to the hungover freshman in his 101 class who would say, I can't find a story, because he would send you out on the quad and tell you not to come back until you found somebody and interviewed them and got a story out of them. We all have stories. What if you don't control marketing or branding and you'd like to apply this? Share what you've learned today. There's plenty of information on the internet. And yes, it'll absolutely help you recruit talent and inspire your team. As I said, during COVID, we work with organizations, and when we have a trademark process called story crafting, which I can talk about later if anybody's interested. The very first meeting, we get the executive team and we sit them down. And during COVID, a lot of times, you know, we would ask sales and marketing and the CFO and the CEO, what's the story of the company? A lot of times the best story was coming from HR, because they had the toughest time. They needed to find talent. They had to work harder than everybody else to figure out what the real story of the organization was. So absolutely, it can help you recruit talent. And I talked about the first step, taking a look at your introduction or your elevator story. So we're almost done here. I'm going to leave you with these thoughts. Consider that elevator speech. See if you can connect that to the story of our organization. Now, as I just mentioned, we do have a process that we do with clients. I always, my view, and this is my own authenticity, do I like people to hire our company? Well, of course. But I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to be a hammer salesman. I'm not going to come in and say, no matter what problem you have, you need to buy my hammer, right? So the most important thing is your story. You decide, is your story clear? Is it aligned? And if you want to know more about what we do to help you, I'm certainly happy to do that. Some examples, some of you have worked at large companies. How do you keep this alive? Start to infuse the concept of story appropriately wherever you can. At a lower level, let's call the capital S story the 30,000-foot view. The 10,000-foot view and the 1,000-foot view, when you have leadership meetings, open a town hall with a story. Share success stories of how your organization has helped the people you serve. Align the onboarding of talent, marketing, and hiring with that core story. In a way, this is about culture. So it's fair to think of it that way. Now, I love this. We do work with a lot of left brain people. They love these numbers. Chip and Dan Heath, anybody know them? Made to Stick is their most famous book. They teach at Stanford Business School, MBA students. It must get boring teaching MBA students every semester because they decided to do this little research one semester. And they had everybody do their end of term presentation. And then they asked all the students about their colleagues, which of the presentations did they remember? 63% remembered the stories and only 5% remembered the statistics. So I love this because this is a statistic that proves the power of stories, right? Isn't that great? All right. I'm done. Elise, Dan, members of the press club, guests, thank you.
Great job.
I'm going to take questions. Where are we at, Diane? We have time for questions? Okay, good.
So bridge the world here. So if I'm in marketing or PR, okay, this makes a lot of sense to me. What if I'm just a journalist? What if I'm a working reporter? What should I take from this presentation? Why do I care?
Thank you. It's a great question. Well, what you should take from this is, number one, validation, that just because somebody reaches out to you, that doesn't mean they're a story. One of the reasons why our firm, under my leadership, took this direction is because I would be approached by people, Tim, and they'd be asking us to write about them. And if I had a few hours worth of time, I could help them come up with a better story, but that's not my job, right? So if you're a journalist, working journalist today, ideally these principles help you in navigating the craziness, the hundreds and hundreds of emails and other things that journalists get these days, and of course the staffing is dropping, et cetera, et cetera. Come back to me when you can tell me why this is news. Come back to me and tell me why I should write about your company rather than other companies that do exactly the same thing. Make them work for it, and they should. Not only to get good media coverage, but because it's going to help them in all the other areas I talked about.
Do you think the archetypes, if I'm a reporter, should I be looking at those and asking myself, where does it fit?
Yeah, I think reporters, a lot of them do this without consciously thinking about it. Lewis Lapham was editor of Harper's Magazine years ago, and he used to tell this story. He's even older than me, way older. But he worked for one of the big New York newspapers, I think in the early 60s. And there was a guy on the rewrite desk, and he was drunk all the time. Well, that's why he was on the rewrite desk. For those of you who aren't that old, those that do report, those who can't are on the rewrite desk. And so Lapham couldn't understand how this guy kept his job. And finally, he did something that got him fired, okay? And when they cleaned out the guy's desk, they found this cross-tabbed indexed notebook, like a 300-page spiral-bound notebook, and it had all these templates for stories. So when he was on deadline rewriting a story, he would just flip over to the right page and start to fill in the blanks right? I guess on his typewriter or computer, I don't know what it was. And the relevance to what you asked him is this. There are stories that are archetypes in the news, right? I was telling a few people on the way up here, we got a crisis client, and a couple of cops might have done something wrong. So we're working with a municipality to help them manage the situation. I know what the stories are going to be next. I know what the first story is. I know what the second story is. I know what the third story is. Not because I'm a genius, but because there is a rhythm and a pace and a process that the news media typically follows. That's why people hire PR agencies. They don't think about that all the time, but we do. You know, I was having lunch with a client not too long ago, and I said, yeah, that's just part of the Friday news dump. He's like, what's that? So I explained it to him. He's like taking out a napkin and writing that down. I'm like, everybody in journalism knows what a Friday news dump is. A nice, great client, but he'd never heard that term before. The things that journalists do and take for granted, a lot of people don't really understand. Yes?
Hi, I really enjoyed everything. Thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
today. I work in higher education,
Yes.
PR, marketing, and recruitment. And I'm really interested in the wheel that you showed us.
Yes.
Because one of the things I struggle with is all of my instructors are people that have done the job in the field, and getting them to tell their story to me, because it does matter. Like our welding instructor, for example, the first time he picked up a welder, he was 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
In his dad's barn. So like, but it's a struggle for me to identify, I know the story, but to help him, number one, get that out. But
Yes.
also in that wheel, is there a way that you can recommend to us to help match people up each part? Because I may assume that, you know, they're one thing, what did you say? Like a creator or a caregiver.
Yes.
Maybe that's how I perceive them.
Yes.
But maybe that's really not their core story that I need to be telling. How can we help drill down to tell those stories?
Well, that's another great question. So a couple of points. Number one, typically what we find is that a company or an individual fits with more than one archetypal story, right? We worked with an ambulance company a few years ago, and you know, what did they think their archetypal story is? They're caregivers. They're doing oil changes and brake jobs on ambulances. So everybody in healthcare can't be a caregiver, right? There has to be another facet or element that goes with that. So your instructor in your case is a welder. That's what he does. Why does he do it?
Right.
You know, and that might start to help you tease that out. One of the things that our clients rely on us for is, in a way, it's kind of like therapy, right? So it's like, tell me your story, right? And then we ask more questions. And we have a number of people on our team who are former journalists, and this is what helps. We dig down deeper and deeper to find the root story, if you will.
So I have a background in radio, and I interview people for radio news, and so those kind of things come easy to me, but is there something that I can identify, like maybe give them to fill out that can help identify that? Because sometimes they don't believe me when I say I see that in you, and like,
Right.
you really need to talk about that. They're like, oh, no, I'm not a good fit, you know, but I know that it's in them. But if they can maybe see a result, like in a survey or something, to match them with this, they might have more buy-in to share that. So do you have any way to recommend that?
Yes, so two things. One, what you just said, to have a very simple, ideally one page that asks provocative questions. You're asking them, why do you do what you do? What gives you the most satisfaction in your job? Tell me a story about you doing what you do that made a difference for you, right? Those kinds of questions. And they may not answer all of them, and they may not dig deep on all of them, but it gives you something to work with. And then the second thing that works really well is to identify people just like them at other organizations who've done what we would like them to do. Sometimes they're competitors, sometimes it's somebody in another state, miles and miles away. Yes, Jonathan.
Paul, thank you so much for the presentation.
You're welcome.
I am not a journalist, and the perspective that I obtained and have been obtaining through even this organization has been very positive, because prior to even my position, it's all been by chance. You know, I'm just ending up in some story or ending up being photographed in some way. But this has been truly inspirational, and I'd like to actually ask a question of the room of who is a current student, despite any kind of university or anything like that. Any students in here? And one. And who is under the age of 40? Sorry, I mean, but it's only a few.
What'd you say?
I'm probing. And I'm being open-minded and sort of probing a little to say that my generation and a buffer in between is a huge opportunity for something like this as you're presenting. And I sort of aspire to create a platform for that opportunity to grow. So if there's any way that we can have you back, I hope to see you.
Oh, that's kind of.
And any other resources that you have to provide us, I'd be willing to distribute.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I will send Diane the slides, and this is a landing page on our website where I have a number of things people can look at to learn more about this. I often say that, you know, there's 50,000 words in my book, so I could talk about this for hours, but I will not do that. But certainly, if anybody would like to have a one-on-one conversation, I'm happy to do that afterwards. All my contact information is there. All right, thank you.